Fernando Alonso, the man who defeated time, somewhere in northern Spain, in an industrial city pressed against the Asturian coast, a 3-year-old boy climbed for the first time into a homemade cart his father had built from scrap metal. There was no budget, no academy, no godfather in the paddock. Just a mechanic father, the dimly lit garage, and a kid who from the very first second he touched the wheel never wanted to do anything else with his life. That was 1984. 40 years later, that same man was still competing in Formula Uno against drivers who had been born when he was already a world champion. And not just competing, winning poles, fighting for podiums, still considered one of the fastest over a single lap. That's what stops you cold when you first encounter this story, because Formula Uno is ruthless with time. Drivers arrive young, shine for a window of 5, 10 years if they're lucky, and then disappear. There is a constant machine of fresh talent, 20-year-olds with video game reflexes and no fear because they don't yet know what it means to lose. The sport celebrates them, hands them the best cars, turns them into champions. And anyone past 35 gets quietly retired without too much fuss. Except for one, Fernando Alonso didn't just survive that process, he defied it for decades. He was champion at 24. He won his second title at 25. He fought Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel, and Max Verstappen. Different generations, different technical eras, different regulations, and in each of them there was at least one season where Alonso was the fastest driver on the planet, even if someone else took the trophy home. How is that even possible? How does someone stay at the top of a sport this technical and physically demanding for so long? The answer, it turns out, is more complicated and more fascinating than simply saying he's a genius or that he has an extraordinary will to win. Because he has both of those things, yes, but there are layers underneath that most people have never explored, and there's another question this story raises, perhaps the most important one. Why did Fernando Alonso, considered by many inside the paddock to be the greatest driver in the history of Formula Uno, never win a third world championship? What does that say about the sport? About luck, about politics, about the limits of what a human being can achieve when the machinery surrounding them simply isn't good enough? Before we dive into the full picture of this story, how Alonso grew up, how he dominated, how he was betrayed, how he fell, and how he came back, I want to pause for a second. Because this community watching these videos from every corner of the planet is honestly one of my favorite things about making them. So drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and when you first discovered Fernando Alonso. I guarantee there will be responses from Asturias all the way to Japan, and that's exactly what makes it worth doing. Now let's go back to a garage in Oviedo where one of the greatest stories in motorsport was beginning to take shape. To understand Fernando Alonso, you first have to understand where he came from. And when we say where he came from, we're not just talking about a place on a map. We're talking about a context that made everything almost impossible before it made it feel inevitable. Asturias is not Monaco, it's not Sao Paulo or London or any of the places that the collective imagination of Formula Uno associates with champions. It's an industrial region in northern Spain, historically defined by coal and steel, a hard-working and austere culture, and a green, rain-soaked landscape that has absolutely nothing in common with the palm trees of the great circuits. There was no elite karting network, no driver academy, no direct connections to the European racing world. What there was José Luis Alonso, Fernando's father, an amateur mechanic, a motorsport enthusiast, a man who had no money but had his hands and his time. He built Fernando's first kart literally from scratch. He made it work, and when he saw that his son didn't just know how to drive it but did so in a way that wasn't normal, he made the decision that would define everything that came after, to bet on him with no safety net. That needs to be put in perspective. The families that make it to Formula Uno through karting in the 80s and 90s generally have money. Not necessarily fortunes, but enough financial backing to cover championship entries, competition karts, travel, mechanics, spare parts. It's an expensive world. It was even more expensive back then relative to Spanish middle-class wages of the time. The Alonsos had none of that. What they had was resourcefulness. They built and repaired everything themselves. They slept in the car during race weekends. They chased global sponsors with the same intensity that other people chased jobs. And Fernando, throughout all of this, kept winning. He won regional championships, then national ones, then competed on the international karting circuits and kept winning there too. This is where the story starts to get genuinely interesting, because in karting, which is the most reliable talent identification pipeline that exists in motorsport, Alonso was identified by everyone who watched him as something different. Not just fast, different. There was something in his ability to read a race, to manage his tires, to adapt to changing conditions that people who knew what they were looking at recognized as exceptional. The problem was that recognizing it and turning it into a professional career were two entirely different things. For that, you needed the money that didn't exist and the connections that hadn't been built. What changed everything was Adrián Campos, a former Spanish driver from Valencia who had raced in Formula Uno in the late 80s with limited success but solid contacts. Campos saw Alonso, understood what he had in front of him, and became the first link in the chain that would carry a kid from Oviedo all the way to the starting grid of the Australian Grand Prix. But even with Campos, the path was never straight. It was a series of financial maneuvers, phone calls, gambles and luck. Alonso arrived in Formula 3000, the step immediately below Formula Uno, with a budget that barely covered the full season. And from there he made the leap to Formula Uno with Minardi in 2001, one of the most modest teams on the grid, with a car that regularly started near the back and on a good day finished somewhere in the lower points positions. It didn't matter. That was the biggest stage in world motorsport, and Alonso, at 19 years old, began doing there what he had always done, learning faster than anyone else. What happened between 2001 and 2005 is one of the most accelerated learning trajectories ever documented in modern Formula Uno. And it's worth pausing here, because there's a tendency to narrate this part of Alonso's career as though it were linear. Aston he arrived at Minardi, passed through Renault as a test driver, returned as a race driver, and won the championship following a perfectly laid out plan. That's not how it went. The year Alonso spent as Renault's reserve driver in 2002 was, by his own account on various occasions, one of the hardest of his career. He wasn't racing, he was training, developing, running laps in the simulator and during tests. While his contemporaries were accumulating race kilometers, he was accumulating technical knowledge and quietly going out of his mind with frustration. There were moments when it wasn't clear whether he would ever get another seat. What saved him was a combination of things. His pace was so evident in every test that Renault simply couldn't ignore it. Flavio Briatore, the team principal, was a businessman rather than a technician, but he had a nose for talent and he knew he had something extraordinary on his hands. And Renault's technical project, led by Mike Gascoigne and later Pat Simmons, was building a car that someone with that kind of speed could do serious things with. In 2003, back as a race driver, Alonso won the Hungarian Grand Prix. He was 21 years old. He became the youngest Grand Prix winner in history at that point. The record lasted a few years until Sebastian Vettel came along, but the milestone marked something more important than the statistic. It marked the moment the Formula Uno world understood that this driver wasn't a promise anymore. He was a reality, and in 2005, the championship arrived. The 2005 season is difficult to describe if you didn't live through it in real time. Renault and McLaren were building cars of comparable speed. Fernando Alonso and Kimi Raikkonen, the glacial Finn driving the McLaren, were locked in one of the purest and most demanding battles of that decade. There was no clear dominator, no technological gap deciding things before the lights went out. It was driver against driver, decision against decision, lap after lap. Alonso won the championship with a consistency that was almost infuriating for his rivals. He wasn't always the quickest in qualifying. He didn't always have the fastest car at every circuit, but he finished races. He managed complicated situations. He made strategic calls that other drivers with perhaps more raw speed might not have made because they didn't have his ability to see the entire race unfolding in their head while they were still in the middle of driving it. He was 24 years old, the youngest world champion in history at the time, and the following year, he did it again. Now comes the part of this story that many people know from the headlines but very few understand in its full depth. Because what happened from 2007 onward isn't just the story of a driver who stopped winning championships. It's something far more complex. It's the story of how an environment can destroy even the most prepared driver in the world. The signing of Alonso by McLaren for the 2007 this season looked like the perfect union. The best driver in the world, by general paddock consensus, joining the team that had accumulated more victories and championships than any other in the sport's recent history. Ron Dennis, the team principal, was legendary for his obsession with perfection. The car that Adrian Newey had designed before leaving for Red Bull promised to be one of the fastest on the grid. What nobody had calculated, or what someone calculated and decided to ignore, was the dynamic that would emerge when Alonso arrived at that team and met his teammate. Lewis Hamilton was 21 years old. It was his first year in Formula 1, and from the very first race of the season it was absolutely clear that he was not there to play a supporting role. What followed was one of the most destructive internal wars in modern Formula 1 memory. Alonso, accustomed to being the undisputed team leader, found himself in a situation where McLaren was treating both drivers as equals, while the media narrative was building Hamilton as the next great hero, and Alonso felt pushed to a secondary status that didn't match his standing in the sport. Tensions escalated. There was an incident in qualifying in Hungary where Alonso held Hamilton in the garage longer than necessary, allegedly to compromise his qualifying lap. The FIA investigated. McLaren was penalized in the Constructors' Championship. The relationship between Alonso and the team broke down irreparably. At the end of the season, Hamilton, Raikkonen and Alonso all arrived at the final Grand Prix in Brazil with a mathematical chance of winning the championship. Raikkonen took it. Alonso finished third in the standings, level on wins with Hamilton but behind on other results. He left McLaren after a single year. The move that was supposed to launch him toward 3 or 4 more championships became one of the most turbulent episodes of his career. He returned to Renault for 2008 and 2009. The cars were no longer the ones from 2005 and 2006. Renault's dominance had ended. Alonso did extraordinary things with machinery that wasn't top tier, which for the technicians and analysts watching from inside was perhaps the strongest proof of his talent. But the championship results simply didn't come. And then something happened that, at the time, looked like the defining move. Ferrari came calling. You have to understand what Ferrari means in the culture of Formula 1 to appreciate the weight of that moment. It's not a team, it's an institution, the only constructor that has competed in every single world championship since the first one in 1950. More wins and more championships than any other team. A following that isn't a fan base but a religion, with millions of supporters around the world who call themselves the Tifosi and who live and die with every result. Being a Ferrari driver is, for many, the ultimate destination in a Formula 1 career. Nigel Mansell wanted it so badly it nearly cost him the title he eventually won. Michael Schumacher built his legend there. Ayrton Senna died before he could do what everyone knew he wanted to do, race under the prancing horse. Alonso arrived at Ferrari in 2010 with 30 years behind him and a hunger that hadn't diminished by a single gram since the days of the scrap metal cart his father had built. What followed over 5 seasons was an almost solitary demonstration of what an exceptional driver can do with a car that isn't always the fastest. In 2010 he arrived at the final Grand Prix in Abu Dhabi with a chance to win the championship, leading the race, and got stuck behind a slow Renault while Sebastian Vettel, in the Red Bull that Adrian Newey had made otherworldly, came from behind and snatched it away in the final laps. In 2012 he produced perhaps the most impressive individual performance of the modern era. With a Ferrari that several technical analyses placed as the 3rd or 4th fastest car on the grid, Alonso arrived at the closing races of the season leading the championship. Vettel overtook him at the end with a string of consecutive victories. But Alonso's performance that year is still studied in the context of what a single driver can compensate for through his own resources alone. The numbers are brutal. In 3 seasons at Ferrari, Alonso was runner-up in the World Championship twice in cars that were not the best on the grid. That has no precedent in the modern history of the sport. It means that in those seasons he was better than his machinery allowed him to appear, that he bridged a real technological gap through speed, management, and race intelligence. The 3rd championship he should have doesn't exist not because of bad luck alone, though bad luck certainly played its part. It was taken from him by the structure of a sport where the car matters more than the driver in 90% of circumstances. And Fernando Alonso had the misfortune of hitting his peak years in terms of performance during the era of Red Bull's total domination. What came next is the part of the story many people prefer to ignore, because it doesn't fit neatly into any clean narrative. In 2015, Alonso returned to McLaren. Honda had come back to Formula Uno as an engine supplier, and the historic McLaren-Honda combination, which in the late 80s had won 4 consecutive championships with Senna and Prost, was being presented as the most ambitious project in the paddock. It was a disaster of historic proportions. The Honda engine didn't work, not in the sense of being inferior to Mercedes or Ferrari, in the sense that for 3 full seasons it was so unreliable and so underpowered that Alonso, one of the 2 or 3 best drivers in the world, regularly found himself unable to qualify inside the top 10. There were Grand Prix where the McLarens were systematically the slowest cars in the entire field. In the era of open team radio communications, the words Alonso used on air to describe the state of the engine became an international meme that mixed tragedy and dark humor in equal measure. During those 3 years, those who were closely following the telemetry noted that Alonso was still producing laps that in terms of extracting the maximum from the car were extraordinary. That the gaps between him and his teammates, Jenson Button and Stoffel Vandoorne, remained as wide as they had always been. That the problem was not the driver, but in terms of visible results, grid positions, championship points, those 3 years effectively erased from the rankings a man who should have been fighting for the podium every single weekend. Alonso used that time to do something else that revealed a great deal about his character. While trying to fix what couldn't be fixed at McLaren Honda, he went to the Dakar Rally, the FIA World Endurance Championship, the 24 Hours of Le Mans with Toyota, the Indianapolis 500, and the Formula A Championship. It wasn't escapism, it was the systematic exploration of a man who wanted to find out whether he could win in any format that motorsport put in front of him. The answer, in almost every case, was yes. He won Le Mans, he won the Dakar, he came agonizingly close to winning Indianapolis in 2017, his first and only attempt, with a genuinely competitive car, until the engine failed with just a handful of laps remaining. Had it held together, it would have been one of the greatest individual achievements in the history of motorsport. And then, when it looked like the story had ended in the worst possible way, when every timeline pointed to the window having finally closed, Alonso came back to Formula Uno. He returned with Alpine in 2021. He was 40 years old. The journalists covering the comeback framed it as a man returning to close the chapter, to say goodbye with dignity, to enjoy the final miles of a glorious career. It was an understandable narrative, and it was completely wrong. Alonso didn't come back to say goodbye. He came back because he believed he could still win. And over the seasons that followed, first with Alpine, then with Aston Martin, he produced some of the most impressive performances of his entire career. Not victories, because the cars didn't give him that, but fastest laps, braking maneuvers that left rivals 20 years his junior speechless, race strategies he was still reading better than anyone else in the field. In 2023, at 41 years old, he scored his 100th podium. He was the oldest driver ever to achieve it. According to telemetry data, he was still one of the 5 fastest drivers on the grid in absolute terms. What that means statistically is almost impossible to contextualize. Formula Uno had no framework of reference for it because it had never happened before. Drivers don't do that. Drivers arrive, shine, and leave. Alonso arrived, shone, left, came back, and kept shining while looking down the pit lane at teammates who had been born in a different century and carrying decades of accumulated experience they couldn't come close to matching. What does all of this say about Fernando Alonso? What conclusion can be drawn from a career that has lasted more than 2 decades and still hasn't ended? The first thing it says is something about the nature of talent. There's a widespread belief that athletic talent is essentially physical, reflexes, reaction speed, muscular conditioning, things that time inevitably erodes. Alonso systematically challenges that belief because his talent was never primarily physical. It was always cognitive. Alonso's single lap speed has a significant physical component, yes, But what makes him exceptional is his ability to process information in motion, to make split-second decisions that account not just for the lap he's currently driving but for the 20 that follow, to adapt to changing conditions with a fluidity that his rivals describe as almost unnatural. That kind of intelligence doesn't disappear with age the way pure reaction speed does. It can be maintained, even improved, through experience, and Fernando Alonso has more experience competing in Formula 1 than any other driver in history. The second thing this career says is something about justice in sport. And here the story gets complicated, because if Alonso is, as many inside the paddock believe, the most complete and most talented driver of his generation, then the question of why he only has 2 championships is a question the sport itself should be asking. Formula 1 is not a sport of pure merit. It never has been. It's a sport where money, technology, internal politics and chance carry as much weight as a driver's talent. That's part of what makes it fascinating, but it's also part of what makes it profoundly unfair at times. Fernando Alonso lost championships to engines that blew up, to cars that simply weren't good enough, to teammates who shifted the internal dynamic at the worst possible moment, and to rivals who had the luck, or the merit, depending on how you look at it, of being in the right team at the right time. What he never lost was the speed, or the conviction that he could win, or the desire to return to a starting grid on a Sunday morning and prove, one more time, that the kid from the garage in Oviedo was still the fastest when the lights went out. That, in the end, is what makes Fernando Alonso his story worth telling. Not just the championships he won, but what he did with the years in which he won none. And the question this story leaves open, the same question every great story leaves open, is how many versions of Fernando Alonso we're leaving untold because we only pay attention to those with trophies on the shelf. The centers of world motorsport have not always been where we were looking. And the best driver of his generation has not always had the best car. That says very little about his talent and a great deal about the sport we love.